It's going to take us a while to get there. I'm not going to lie to you. This one will be a straight up history lesson today. Okay, so if you're a little bit sleepy, it's interesting. It's just I got a lot of history to get through here in the 4th century, and we'll get to the triumph of the church and the scriptures that go with it. But I'm going to do some reading to you and give you a bit of a history lesson, kind of the first part of this. That we're going to kind of see as the church now moves into the 4th century, right? Lots of persecutions in the first 3 centuries of the church. And the church continued to expand and continue to grow despite of that. Now we're going to get into the 4th century in which we're going to see the church getting some triumph as the persecution of Rome ends, and we see Christianity's kind of place within the empire, and how the borders of Christianity expanded as well today. We will look at one scripture, Matthew chapter 10. Let's go there first. Just guys have a quick introduction. Matthew chapter 10, go to verse 37. We'll be back at chapter 18 here in a little bit. 10:37. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. When Jesus is speaking directly here to his disciples in Matthew 10, he candidly declares that unqualified allegiance to him must come before what? Everything, right? Allegiance to Christ comes before everything, including family. And only he, Jesus Christ, being God, only he has the ability to demand that type of loyalty, right? Putting the Lord first to that extent in our lives, of course, is going to preserve us, right? In the face of persecutions or whatever the problem may be. Each day we go through our life, it's going to it tests our loyalty to Christ. How do we make decisions? Problems coming up? How do we deal with those things? How do we make the decision without, of course, petitioning God beforehand? Snares of idolatry, snares of temptation that can kind of cause us problems as well. When we commit to desires that compete with our loyalty to Jesus Christ, we aren't being as loyal as he has required us to be. Okay? 4th century church kind of finds that the same thing happening to them. Empire is now beginning to continuing to be there, and the church then now finds it essentially becoming the favored religion of the empire in the 4th century. Okay, so obviously much blessings coming to the church. Purses and things are going to expand. People are going to expand. Borders are going to expand the church. But it's going to be challenges as well to the loyalty to Christ. And that's what we're going to look at here within the 4th century, as kind of give us a reminder here of how we need to defend and preserve the gospel today. Because people and nations obviously fight for freedoms because they have the opportunities to do what they want to do. We should also value freedom by taking full advantage of the opportunities that we have with us. 4th century here that we're going to see quite a contrast. Begins with another round of persecutions first, and then suddenly the church finding itself again in favor. Blessings and challenges, of course, that came. The events of the era, again, defending the gospel. All right, so Jesus here makes it very clear in Matthew chapter 10 that no loyalty at all should come before him. And as we consider the church here at the dawn of the 4th century, we go to this verse and this requirement of the disciples here to kind of remind us as the studier of the church history, as well as being members of the church, that while things may come in and seem pretty nice and may be blessed for a while and living good for a while, it's important that we stay loyal to God, and also to remember that even though the church is going to see some blessings and some, I don't want to call it renaissance, but call it an increase, it's important for them to remember it really wasn't that long ago burned at the stake and ran down just for maybe even having the hint of Christianity in her life. So while things may seem good now for the church in the 4th century, it's important even for us too. A dark storm of persecution could be on the horizon, and is going to be on the horizon. So for about 10 years here in the 4th century, professing Christians are going to continue to encounter what they call the universal persecution of the Roman state. So the first 10 years of the 4th century, any professing Christian was going to get the full wrath of Rome on them, which led to a variety of tortures, a variety of them being in the Colosseums, as we saw last week. As a matter of fact, the majority of the Colosseums in the early 3rd and 4th century, all the stuff we kind of see in the movies and all that kind of thing, the large majority of those killings were Christians. That's what Rome did to those, and that's kind of how they appeased the mob as well, and give them some bloodlust and things kind of happening, and put the Christians in there. It was kind of the way in which they were, in Rome's idea, killing two birds with one stone, getting rid of the Christians and helping to appease the normal populace. So because of that, many Christians, of course, are going to lapse in their faith and loyalty in Christ. Many church leaders handed over scriptures to Rome that were eventually destroyed. In the end, as quickly as it started, the persecution kind of suddenly just ceased later on in the 4th century. And because of that, the church found itself in a favorable position as becoming the favored religion by Rome and being therefore protected by the state of Rome. Okay? To the Roman emperor and the Roman administration, this would have been essentially, when the Biden administration took over on January 20th, whatever it was, if he would have came out and said, we all are going to practice Christianity, all other forms of religion are not going to be considered part of the United States, only Christianity, that would obviously be a big deal, right? It would. You'd have a lot of backlash, like all other things. That would be a big deal if you're going to come out and say that. That's what Rome did, essentially. Okay, so we can kind of see how this would have been quite the change for the Christians of the day. This is going to present a new kind of danger. Remain faithful to the gospel under the empire's favorable outlook towards the religion. Okay, so Rome's final days of persecution of the early church. We see religion's role within the empire. The practice of separation of church and state in the West that we should have as now. We've not seen it as much in the last probably year. But the practice of separation of church and state in the West has been normalized, that the idea of an organized legal connection between state and religion seems odd to us, right? When the government of, let's just for example, if there's MacArthur's church out there in California, when Newsom tried to shut them down, they had the lawsuits and all the stuff that eventually came through. MacArthur obviously won. Same thing with Cuomo there in New York. The Supreme Court ruled about 2 weeks ago that he could not shut down those religious organizations. And if he had been able to, we saw the outcry not just from both sides of the political aisle, but just people in general, because it's one of the statutes of our foundations is the separation of church and state, and it's become really normalized for us, right? We have a problem when the state tries to step in on what we do here at church. That was not the case in Rome, obviously. That really didn't show up until the 17th century, that idea of separation of church and state. A legal organized connection with the church and the government was thought to be kind of a prerequisite for a very cohesive unit of people. They thought that if you were a Roman citizen, you should follow the Roman religion, and that kind of made everybody happy. And that, of course, were able to do other things legally through that. But that was kind of the idea for most of modern history, from the time after Christ's death up until about the 17th century. They thought that without the kind of those two things working cohesively together, that civilization would just crumble. It would disorder. Nobody would be involved, with anything type of order, just kind of run around doing whatever they want to. And that was the case with the Roman Empire. Okay, so to ensure unity between religion and state, the emperor held the title of Pontifex Maximus. Right, and you're going to hear that a lot over the next couple of weeks as we kind of talk how eventually the Roman Catholic Church and different things. That Pontifex Maximus essentially means that the emperor was the high priest. Okay. And we know that in the Roman Catholic Church now, the high priest is called the what? The Pope, okay? And that came from Pontifex Maximus. It kind of has evolved into that. So they considered the emperor to be the high priest. Therefore, the emperor's priesthood was between the people of the empire, okay, and then the traditional gods of Rome. So the people, the gods that were named after the planets and all the things they were kind of worshiping in Paul's time. He was the emperor was kind of the high priest between those two things. And because of that, the civic duties of those people involved in those religions, the high priest, or of course the emperor, kind of oversaw all of those things. Okay. Now, even the emperor himself, then became an object of worship. Obviously, and you can see how that could divulge very quickly. The emperor's in charge of things. He's also the high priest, so people are going to start worshiping the emperor. We can see how that would happen very quickly, and it did. Rome considered religious nearly every activity in society. From simple as this purchasing meat or groceries at the market was considered to be a religious event. Entertaining guests was seen to be a religious event. Traveling, playing sports, let's see what else. Performing weddings and funerals, being part of local guilds or associations, carrying out war, all those things were considered to be religious events. All those activities involved help keep the fabric of the nation together, and that's how it was kind of given to the people there in Rome. Praying and sacrificing as well. That was praying and sacrificing to those deities. Was also within every day of life as well. So that was kind of how Rome's religion, how it worked. So if we were to take religion today in America, how would you characterize religion today in America? If you wanted to characterize it, how would you characterize it? Not Christianity, religion. How would you characterize religion today in America? Compartmentalized. Something that we do, whatever it is, it's part of the weekly job list. Good way to put it. Diverse, very diverse. Optional. Okay, those are all very good explanations of that. What is the government's role in religion in America? What's the one goal of government? What's the one job of government for religion in America? To protect it, right? To protect the freedoms of it. It is sole purpose is to protect the religious freedoms. But it's prohibited, of course, by therefore establishing a state-run religion. The opposite of that. By protecting the freedom means they're not going to have a state-run religion. Okay, that's the government's role in religion. So, Judaism and Christianity's place in the empire. So what's important, I gave you the background of the way that Rome viewed religion, because now we're going to take Christianity and move it essentially what we were calling the last couple of weeks the Roman religion. We're going to put Judaism and Christianity in place of that religion. So all of the legalistic things we just talked about, all of the ways in which Rome followed the religion in their daily lives, now we're going to insert Judaism and Christianity in there as well. Okay? So you can see why in some aspects very good, some aspects not so good. Okay? So Rome then is going to give the Jews here, this is about 419 AD, give the Jews freedom to refrain from the conventional Greco-Roman religions of the day. All right? The Jews were allowed to worship as they wanted to, essentially, because of the Jews' tenacious adherence to monotheism. Right? That was fancy words for the fact that Jews just followed one God. Right? Romans had a bunch of them. Jews were stuck on, they just followed monotheistic ideas of worshiping just one God. The Romans, nevertheless, of course, are going to look upon the Jews with suspicion and label them, eventually calling them atheists, because of the way that they believed. So when the Christian church then becomes primarily the religion of the Gentile, their refusal to adopt Rome's practices and refusal to follow those kind of pagan ideas and sacrifices was not only very suspicious, obviously, to the Romans, but also completely illegal and very treasonous to the state of Rome. So we can see why the persecutions happened. Okay? So it's within this kind of idea, knowing all these things that are happening, that the severe persecutions of the Diocletians was launched. All right? And that was what we spent last week talking about, the Diocletian persecutions and the reasons why they happened. Now, what are some countries today that have a very strong connection between religion and state? What are some countries today that have a very strong connection between their religion and their government or the state? Can you think of any?
The Muslim countries?
Yeah, many of the Middle Eastern countries. Pretty much all of them. Many of the Middle Eastern Arab countries and some of the Northern Africa countries, because that has bled down from the Middle East. They don't allow their people to practice or any other type of religion, but of course Islam. North Korea, of course, would be another one. They have a political ideology that essentially suspends all types of religion. Those are some countries, and are those countries good countries? No, they're not. Okay, they're not. As far as the grand scheme of how things work in the world, they're not. How does a state religion affect the freedom to proclaim the gospel in those countries? Can you just roll up into North Korea and start preaching the gospel? What's probably going to happen to you? You're going to be shocked. Absolutely. Can you roll up into Iran or Uzbekistan or any of those Arab countries and just openly start preaching the gospel on the streets? You could, but you're not going to last very long. You're going to get thrown into a jail or shot. And so that's just what's going to happen. Many countries with a state religion, it is illegal. Sharing the gospel, therefore, of course, has to be done in secret, underneath the watchful eye. Same thing, we know missionaries here in China, and they have to have underground churches and different things going on to spread the gospel because Chinese people, the Chinese government doesn't believe in the type of religion or pretty much anything as far as that goes. So we can see how having a governmental control over the religion can cause some pretty serious problems. Okay, so the Diocletian persecutions became kind of the way of the world there for the first part of the 4th century. Diocletian's edicts of persecution. This was in 303 and 304 in the 4th century. And several factors kind of came into to lead to these pretty harsh conditions. Long-standing economic problems, the decline of religious commitment to the traditional gods, constant threat from Persia on the eastern borders, the invasions of new religion from the east that undermine the traditional Roman beliefs. The unity of the empire here is at stake, and the Christians are simply just added to the list of why the empire is failing. Okay, so that is why these persecutions happened in 304, 303, 305 AD. The edicts first targeted Christian leaders and those who were in the upper class. Christian buildings were destroyed, property was confiscated, bishops were ordered to hand over scriptures that were eventually destroyed as well. And then those groups were ordered to sacrifice to Roman gods out in public to kind of demonstrate the loyalty to Rome and to the emperor. If they didn't, they were going to be imprisoned or killed on the spot. Eventually, all Christians were ordered to sacrifice to any of the traditional Roman deities to show their support. That was part of the Diocletian persecutions that happened in the very first couple years there of the 4th century. All right, and because of that, obviously, that's going to have an impact. If the entirety of Rome is after the Christians, that's going to have an impact on the church. Okay, that's in Croatia now. That is still there. That is Diocletian's retirement palace, which he might eventually quit being part of the Roman Empire. So the eastern portion of that, we're going to see the impact now of these final persecution days here on the church. The eastern portion of the empire, the persecution was much more intense than the western portion. Okay, and it was carried out more effectively and more efficiently as well. Eusebius, was a bishop in the East. He was a good Christian bishop in the East, and he was persecuted. Was due to the sinful carnality and the spiritual complacency of the church. All right, so those who sacrifice to a deity receive certificates indicating they followed the emperor's decree. So if Christians were openly sacrificing to these Roman gods, they essentially got a piece of paper that said they were good, they were okay. Those who did not, there were some, were arrested and put in prison. As those prisons became overcrowded, obviously what are we going to do with these people? So they began just to execute them. In Western Europe, Rome was doing the same thing, that they were confiscating the property, destroying the buildings, but we don't see the edicts of these persecutions happening with as much gumption in the West as we did in the East. They were there, they just weren't being carried out as much. And the reluctance was largely because of Constantinus, the father of Constantine. So this is now, let's move up a little bit on the timeline into the 4th century. This is about the year 10 or 11, 310, 311 AD. Galerius becomes the emperor, and he was the one most responsible for persecutions. Also approved on his deathbed the Edict of Toleration, and this edict released Christians from obligation of sacrificing to Rome. So Galerius, who at the beginning of his reign was one of the worst as far as persecuting Christians, as he gets closer to his deathbed, either has to change of heart or if it's talked into whatever, he kind of releases the persecutions and writes into a decree that kind of free the other Christians who were in prison there already. His successor in the region of Palestine and Egypt comes back in, reinstates the edict. So within months of the Edict of Toleration, Christian leaders in the East were forced once again to go through this persecution, several bishops in Egypt being arrested, and not just arrested, but beheaded in front of the mob. Christians in the United States and other Western nations today, we have not faced those types of awful persecutions because our laws respect freedom of conscience and freedom of voluntary worship. All right, so that was the impact of Diocletian. That was the final persecutions there in the first decade of the 4th century of the church in Rome. So we have had now 310 years of persecution of the church. That's what this has been, 310 years of people dying for the gospel. So in what ways can we as Christians help support those in other parts of the world where the free exercise of religion doesn't exist? Of course, we can pray for them and all those types of things. Could freedom from persecution make believers vulnerable to adopting an attitude of entitlement? That's the question we're going to pivot to. So freedom from persecution, like we have here in America, does that make Christians vulnerable to adopting an attitude of entitlement? Could a lack of persecution lead believers to assume the Christian life is going to be easy? All right? That's the two questions that we're going to spend the next little bit of next week talking about. We have people who don't like us because they're Christians, and we're seeing more and more of that. But I got up, got the girls up, Haley got up. I didn't have to worry about rolling up in here and getting my head chopped off for coming to church today. Didn't have to worry about anybody stopping us or any police or anything, kind of wondering what we're doing. We're not going to have people out here at the back doors when we leave this afternoon arresting us. We don't have those worries. Is that going to come in America? Maybe at some point. Probably in the distant future. Who knows? But as of right now, we don't have to worry about those things. In other places, we do. So does that allow Christians to become vulnerable? I'm going to call you soft. Has that made us soft? And that's kind of that lack of persecution leading to a Christian life that we think to be easy. It's important for us to keep those couple questions in mind here as we move into now a flip in the idea of the church in Rome. Constantine, Constantine was the first emperor to kind of really accept Christianity. Constantine gave favor to the early church and allowed his rise to power allowed Christianity and allowed the gospel and allowed the church to kind of flourish there in Rome. So Constantine's rise to power, that came with the Diocletian trying to, a lot of political stuff happened in Rome. There was an imperial trial against the Diocletian for some of the things he was doing with tax money. That allowed Constantine to come in. All right, to make a long story short and make things a little bit complicated, kind of simple. That allowed Constantine's rise to power. 20 years before Constantine came to power, since the difficulty of ruling the empire was too much for one person, the Diocletian had kind of divided the empire up into different divisions and then allowed each of those divisions to be ruled by a governor in one of those places. Okay, they called them realms. This also even became too difficult to manage because Rome had gotten so big. So each emperor had a vice emperor who had a lieutenant governor, and we kind of see that kind of having power kind of got pushed out through the entirety of the empire of Rome. The vice emperors were to become the successors when the senior emperors retired, so on and so forth. This essentially resulted in 4 rulers called the Tetrarchy, which became over the 4 realms of Rome. Constantine's father, Constantius, was one of those 4 rulers. All right? And this probably seems a little wordy and boring to you all. I think this is kind of neat. So we had the Empire of Rome under Diocletian that was divided into subdivisions. And then each of those subdivisions essentially became 4 quarters of Rome. Each of those 4 quarters of Rome had an emperor over them that served underneath the main emperor. And then those 4 emperors had people underneath them as well, the trickle down of power. All right, those 4 major realms, those 4 governors made up kind of the 4 people that reported to the emperor. Constantine's dad was one of those 4 guys because he was kind of one of the second in command guys. And from that, we see that's why when Constantius died in 306, his army of the 4th realm of Rome kind of just took Constantine and said, you're in charge now. They liked him. He was around. He was a good leader of men. They said, you're in charge now. So by 312, Constantine was at war with the self-appointed emperor of Rome, Maxentius. And Constantine was a good leader of men. He was one of the first servant leaders we see in Rome. People just kind of flocked to him. And we eventually see him going over the Alps, going eventually over the Milvian Bridge, which was a bridge on the north side there of the empire. And 2 contemporary Christians wrote of Constantine. Eusebius, who we saw last week, Constantine had a vision of cross with words, conquer by this. That night he had a dream to use a vision as a standard of the army. So as Eusebius talks about Constantine. Another writer, Lactantius, wrote that Constantine had a dream to put a divine sign on the shields of his soldiers. So Constantine had some Christian background at some point in his life. Maybe he went to one of these bishops' church, but he was kind of being divinely led to conquer in the way that he was. Difficult battle. Constantine's forces eventually prevail, and he becomes the emperor of the Western Empire, and this is in 324 AD. Okay, he was ruled there for 12 years. He defeated the East, Lignius, and became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire in 325 AD. Okay, so Constantine was, according to the early Christian contemporary writers, Constantine was being divinely led in the way in which he was conquering Rome, essentially. And because of that, now that he is in charge, he has some new imperial laws that he puts in. Okay, so here is Constantine. A couple of these statues of Constantine still standing. There's one of him in England. That is on one of those main streets there in England. But he rises to power, and he has favored here to the early church. And he has some laws that kind of favor the early church as well. Now, the spiritual commitment in Constantine's life is not written down anywhere. We can't go to the history books and see the moment in which Constantine got saved or see he had a spiritual advisor in any way. But at some point in Constantine's life, I wouldn't call it a come to Jesus moment, but he's had some spiritual influence from good Christian people. Now, his father, Constantinus, he worshiped the sun. There's all kinds of writings for that. But the level of spiritual commitment that changed in Constantine, we don't know what it is, so we're not going to spend a lot of time focusing there. What we will focus on are the changes that Constantine instituted. All right? So, a couple things before we finish for today. As emperor, Constantine enacted laws that reversed the imperial policy towards Christian. Now, instead of persecuting them, they are shown favor. Okay? He annuls all the laws against Christianity, releases all of the Christian prisoners, returns the seized properties, starts to help build back some of their churches as well, paid for building repairs out of the imperial fund. Okay? He made Sunday a state holiday. So now we kind of see the first time that happens. He takes Sunday and makes it a state holiday. And then enacts laws that expand the honor and responsibility of bishops. He exempts bishops from paying certain taxes. Okay. Grants them legal responsibilities in adjudicating civil matters. So some of the things that we see pastors doing today, Constantine kind of started that back in Rome, which is kind of interesting and kind of cool to think about. He oversaw the passing of legislation to reflect an overall higher moral standard in Rome. So if we're Christians during this time, the response to this would have been, probably maybe a little tentative at first, thinking maybe this is a trap, but eventually once you realize this was a real thing, this would have been a big deal. Probably jubilation is the reality. It's kind of setting in of how life is going to be quite a bit better. Constantine sets a trajectory here of state policies that change history completely. First time in history, Christianity becomes the favored religion. Constantine, in no point does he merge state and the church, but he does kind of make religion, Christianity the major religion. That idea of merging religion and the state, that doesn't happen for about another 70 years. So paganism is still legal, still the most prevalent religion in Rome. But Constantine creates a course here for the empire and the Christian church to kind of have a relationship and a good cooperation within that. One example of this, and we'll finish up. Constantine reacted seriously to heresy and divisions in the church that threatened the church's ability to be stable and then, therefore, the stability within the empire. So near the end of the 4th century, Christianity was declared the state religion. As Constantine moves on, the next emperor is Theodosius. He declares Christianity the state religion and then outlaws the worship of pagan gods. That becomes illegal. So church buildings begin to reflect imperial tastes. So we start to see some of these churches have a lot of artistry, a lot of grandeur, a lot of the beautiful cathedrals and stuff that we see now. This all starts now in the later part of the 4th century. The simple architecture, obviously, in the Constantine era becomes to ramp up, and we see these big cathedrals and stuff that we're going to see now. That all started here in the 4th century of Rome. Okay? We're going to stop right there for a second. Constantine continues to do some patronage here at the church. We're going to see next week. He participates there in Nicaea and the Council of Nicaea, which was the council I was trying to think of last week when we were talking. And so he has part in some things that really help Christianity move forward. Okay, what we're doing here is, I know that was a huge history lesson that some of you probably didn't much enjoy. I like it, but what we're doing is setting the stage now for the fact that Christianity is going to be blessed by the state. We're going to see kind of the reaction of everyday Christians living in the midst of this. Things have drastically changed for them. And then how it has kind of allowed some problems to enter that we're going to see a little more next week as there's some lingering effects on Christianity that Constantine's rule has, and then how that kind of propels that into the 5th and 6th century. All right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, again, as we go back and look here at the history of the church, it sometimes can be what we may think a little bit, who cares? But it's important for us to study and to see kind of the way in which you allowed your people to sustain, and not just sustain, but increase in the midst of some things that were happening that just weren't really good. And how faithful men and women to the cause, Lord, to continue to expand the borders of the church, and people will continue to be saved. There's a ton of people not in hell because of the faithfulness of early Christians. Burned at the stake, getting heads chopped off, all the different terrible things that were happening. They remained true to their beliefs, to their relationship with you, and because of that, other people were saved. And eventually we're having church here because of it. So we're thankful for the way in which you preserved your gospel in the midst of some pretty kind of perilous times. And how we're going to now look and see the kind of the reaping of the benefits of those persecutions, and how it's important to be mindful of how quickly persecutions or problems can come, and allow that, Lord, for us not to become complacent in our worship of you, as some of the early church members did. I'll pray for Pastor Rob here too, as he comes in the next little bit.